it's Sloan. Welcome back. So I'm here with just a little quick hit on some things to think about when and why to seam a given sweater versus to do it seamlessly. And I should say at the outset, we're talking about, for a given sweater. This is not a sort of abstract theory about are seams good or are seams bad, or are certain armhole constructions good or bad. As many of you know, we kind of classify sweaters by armhole, so by how they attach to the body. So you've got set-in sleeves, you've got yokes, you've got raglans, you've got drop shoulders, you've got dolmans, you've got integrated constructions. There's a bajillion ways to make a sweater, and it's part of what makes knitting awesome, right? Is that there's so many choices. So what this question is sort of about, given that you like a particular sweater and you would like to make it, and you have a particular yarn you'd like to make it in, and that sweater has a particular armhole construction and a particular way the pattern's written, should you think about modifying it or not, and what makes that sweater particularly suitable for either a seamed or a seamless construction? The broader question about what kinds of armhole types hold up best and things like that is like sort of a separate issue that we'll get into in more depth later, but this is kind of just for a given sweater, what factors should you think about when deciding whether to knit it with seams or without? So the first question is fiber type. So some fibers, as we know, have more elasticity than others and more structural resilience than others. Something like silk or linen adds a lot of drape, adds almost no elasticity and rebound to the sweater. And so once things kind of start to pull, they're gonna keep pulling. Same thing with alpaca. Alpaca adds warmth, it adds drape, it adds gloss. It's wonderful, wonderful fiber. It's one of my favorite things to work with. It does not add elasticity. So if you make a sweater in 100% alpaca, I think anybody who's made one has experienced how much it grows, right? So if it's growing and growing and you've made it in a seamless construction, it's also pulling the yoke, the sort of structurally important part of the sweater from the shoulders up, it's pulling that out further and further. So the fiber, the more it needs seams and structural support to hold it together. So if you're using a crunchier, I'll put crunchy in quotes because wool's not really that crunchy, a crunchier woolen spun yarn with a lot of heft and a super long staple length and stuff like that, that's gonna kind of felt into itself as you block it, that sweater is gonna need a different level of structural support than a sweater made out of hand-dyed superwash merino where the stitches really kind of pull away from each other rather than pulling close together. If you've made anything out of a superwash yarn and you've watched as you block it, the stitches don't bloom into each other, and that's because of how the superwash is treated. So that's sort of a separate issue than the overall drapiness of the fiber question about things like silk and alpaca. So basically, the less the stitches themselves hold together, the more you need things like seams to hold the sweater together. The next thing is anything that affects fabric weight. So this is stitch patterning, this is length and width of the sweater, overall size of the sweater, sleeve length, how many elements the sweater has, whether it's a cardigan or a pullover, those kinds of things. The heavier, and again, we're all on a spectrum, right? The heavier the sweater, the more it needs seams. And it doesn't necessarily, again, yarn diameter is not necessarily the predictor here. There are Aran weight yarns, like Woolfolk Tove is a great example. Any cable spun yarn, it's got a ton of air in it, right? So even though it's bigger in diameter than a fingering weight yarn, it doesn't necessarily have a ton more weight. On the other hand, if you have like Quince Osprey is a woolly wool that's sort of Aran to chunky weight, and it's quite round and lovely, but it's a quite dense yarn. I have a Osprey sweater, it's quite heavy. I'm really, really glad it has seams because that's helping support that sweater over time. The sort of third thing is use case. So if it's a cardigan versus a pullover, if it's a pullover and it stays on your body all day and it doesn't get fussed with that much, it may need less structural support than a cardigan that you're taking on and off frequently. And again, this just has to do with how much pulling and wear and sort of fuss that, again, the yoke, that structural part of the sweater is going to take. And if the answer is not much, that's a totally different story than a sweater that's going to take a lot of abrasion and a lot of back and forth between, for example, the back of your chair, which is not a super sweater friendly place, but people put sweaters on the backs of their chairs, and your body all the time, those kinds of things. The most important issue by far is knitter preference. A sweater that is designed in a way that is structurally perfect for that sweater doesn't matter if it never gets made, right? So you have to make it in a way that's going to work for you and your knitting. I've talked a lot about the fact that I just like have a terrible attention span for things with long rows. So particularly if I'm knitting something like a drop shoulder sweater with a ton of positive ease, I don't really want to make a 22-inch wide piece, a 44-inch circumference, right? Which is what an 8-inch positive ease sweater for me is, like about a 44. I don't really want to knit a 44-inch circumference in one row because like that mentally is too much for me, especially if it's got lots of cables on it. But for some people, that's totally your jam. Sears Point, the new sweater that I'm working on now, had a ton of stockinette in the round, and it was fine. It was super relaxing. It was really great travel knitting, no objections whatsoever, right? Like that was fun for me to knit, but it was still quite different from how I frequently knit, which is in pieces and seamed, because I just find the sense of accomplishment that comes from that easier. Some people really, really hate setting in sleeves. A set-in sleeve sweater gives you lots of choices about fit. There's lots of reasons to do it. If you really hate setting in shoulder seams, that's totally fine. You can do the sleeves top down. You can do lots of different ways to make it easier and to avoid the parts of the process that you find unpleasant. And that really should be a driving factor in how you knit a lot of these things. There's no absolutes in knitting. It's part of what's really great about knitting. And so you should feel, even though these kind of guidance factors are helpful about what's going to make your sweater strongest in the long run, you have to knit a sweater in a way that you're going to like, and that you're going to have fun knitting it. Because if you don't love it, it's not worth it. It's too much time and too much effort and too much yarn expense to make something that's not going to make you happy while you're making it and while you're wearing it. So those are some factors to think about when you think about whether to seam a sweater with a given armhole construction and a given stitch pattern. Again, there are sort of other factors about how you match those things, in particular how you match armhole construction and stitch pattern in a way that is both gets the fashion result you want and gets the structural soundness that you're after. But in the short run, given those two things, these are things you should think about how you might want to knit the sweater.